In 2020, a college student named Eric Schubert was scrolling through cold case files when he stumbled upon a story of a 9-year-old girl who had been murdered in 1964. What he discovered would not only change his life, but would finally bring closure to a family that had been waiting 56 years for answers. This is a story of how a 20-year-old genealogy enthusiast accomplished what generations of seasoned investigators couldn't: solving one of Pennsylvania's oldest cold cases. Crime, conspiracy, cults, serial killers, and murder. All things that I love to consume, and I know you do too, you sick, twisted, beautiful, intellectually minded Sounded like a haunted mosquito, didn't it? Anyway, today we are talking about a crazy case that I came across. It is absolutely mind-blowing, so without further ado, let's unbuckle our seatbelts, go Mach 5 down the highway, slam on the brakes, and bust through this windshield into this solved cold case together. Marise Chiverella entered the world on Thanksgiving Day, November 25th, 1954, in Waterloo, New York. Born to Carmen and Mary Chiverella, she was the second of 5 children, who would grow up to embody the tight-knit values of a working-class Italian-American family. And her father, Carmen, originally from Wilkes-Barre, had met her mother, Mary, a Hazleton native. And after spending a few years in New York, the family made the decision to return to Mary's hometown. In Hazleton, Pennsylvania, in the early 1960s, was a community still deeply rooted in its coal mining heritage. And the city sat in the heart of the anthracite region, where generations of families had built their lives around the rhythms of the mines. And though the industry was beginning its decline, the culture still remained. A place where families knew their neighbors, where children walked to school without any sort of fear, and where the Catholic Church served as a backbone of community life. So the Chiverella family settled into the northwest section of Hazleton, where Carmen operated the Little Market, a neighborhood grocery store that sat right next to their home. And it was very demanding work, and Carmen would rise early to pick up supplies, tend to customers from 10 a.m. to 10 p.m. 7 days a week, and handle the bookkeeping late into the night. Meanwhile, Mary worked at one of the downtown knitting mills, contributing to the family's income in an economy that was slowly transitioning away from its industrial roots. But despite the long hours that their parents worked, the Chiverella children experienced a childhood rich with love and tradition. And Sundays were sacred in their household, as Carmen would close the store for exactly 1 hour around lunchtime, and Mary would prepare a special meal, the only time during the week when the entire family could sit together around the table. So Sunday mornings began at Mass at either St. Joseph's or Most Precious Blood Church, reinforcing the deep Catholic faith that guided their family values. And for little Marise, faith wasn't just a family obligation, it was a calling to her. And the little girl with the bright blue eyes and dark hair was known for her gentle soul and caring nature. And she would often tell family that she wanted to become a nun when she grew up, a dream that seemed to fit perfectly with her character. And she was the type of child that just put others before herself. She was extremely selfless, and who found joy in just simple pleasures like playing school with her siblings or tinkering on an organ her parents had bought her at Sears. And in the evening, Marise would sit at the organ composing songs with her big brother, Ron. And their voices just filled the house with music. And she would also share a bedroom with her younger sister, Carmen Marie. And the two girls would brush each other's hair at night while looking up at the 1970s heartthrobs David Cassidy and Ricky Nelson, whose photographs covered their walls. So it was an innocent time when a little girl's biggest concerns were learning to play the organ and helping her family. And the family's daily routine was predictable and comforting. Carmen would be at the store before dawn, preparing for another long day of serving their neighbors, and Mary would head to the knitting mill, working alongside other women who formed the backbone of Hazleton's changing economy. And the children would walk to St. Joseph's parochial school, where nuns in traditional habits provided education infused with Catholic values. So it was a community where everyone knew everyone, where children were safe once again, and where the most shocking news might be about someone's garden not producing tomatoes or the latest church fundraiser. It was a very peaceful community until it wasn't. Because beneath this veneer of small town safety, darkness was lurking. And in 1964, the concept of stranger danger barely existed. And children walked alone to school, played outside unsupervised, and parents felt secure in their tight-knit communities. And the innocence of that era, which allowed children like Marise to roam freely, would soon be shattered by an act of evil that would change not just one family, but an entire community's understanding of safety. So Wednesday, March 18th, 1964 began like any other day in the Chiverella household. At 4:30 a.m., the alarm clock shattered the early morning silence. And Marise would roll over in the bed she shared with her sister, Carmen Marie, whispering, quote, "Close your eyes, Dune," which was her nickname that she gave her little sister. And she also said, "I'm going to turn on the light to get my clothes." And it was just this small act of consideration that would become one of Carmen Marie's most precious memories. Meanwhile, Marise would carefully select her outfit for the day. A dark jacket and skirt with black leotards and a multicolored scarf. She would put on her earrings, slip her silver ring with a small diamond onto her finger, and fasten her yellow gold necklace with this 1-inch cross around her neck. And as she prepared to leave for school, Marise had a special mission that morning, as her teacher, one of the nuns at St. Joseph's parochial school, was celebrating a feast day, and Marise wanted to honor her with a gift. Again, she's just so selfless and sweet and caring, and she would carefully select 2 cans of fruit from her father's grocery store, a gesture that perfectly captured her thoughtful nature. But this act of kindness would change everything. Because instead of walking to school with her siblings as she normally did, Marise decided to leave early so she could drop off the canned goods at her classroom before attending daily mass. And it was an uncharacteristic decision for a girl who typically enjoyed the company of her brothers and sisters on their 6-block walk to school. So at approximately 8:10 a.m., Marise stepped out of her family's home and began walking alone down the familiar streets of Hazleton. And she told Carmen Marie she loved her as she walked down the steps and turned off the light. And Carmen Marie, still sleepy, told her sister she loved her too. But neither girl could have ever imagined these would be their final words to each other. So the route to St. Joseph's parochial school was one Marise had walked countless times. 6 blocks through the northwest section of Hazleton, past houses where she knew the families, and along the streets where neighbors would wave and say good morning. And the early March air was crisp, and she pulled her windbreaker close as she walked, and the 2 cans of fruit secured in her school bag. But what would happen next would remain a mystery for nearly 6 decades, because somewhere along those 6 familiar blocks, between her house and the school where she was expected to arrive for daily mass, Marise encountered someone who would change her life and end it forever. So at school, the nuns noticed when Marise didn't arrive for daily mass. It was unlike her to miss such an important part of her day, especially when she specifically mentioned wanting to give her teacher the canned goods. So when lunchtime came and went, without Marise returning home, her absence became impossible to ignore. And Carmen, her father, was at the grocery store serving customers, and her mother, Mary, was at the knitting mill working. And the other Chiverella children were at school, unaware that their sister was missing. So it was just a normal day at Hazleton, with people going about their normal routines, completely unaware that evil had visited their quiet community. So when the school contacted the family about Marise's absence, concern quickly turned to alarm. Because this wasn't like Marise. She was responsible, devout, and reliable. She didn't run away or skip school. She was the type of child who followed rules and honored commitments. So the realization that something was terribly wrong began to settle over the family like a dark cloud. And Carmen closed the store and began searching around the St. Joseph Church area, desperately hoping to find some sign of his daughter. And police were contacted, and the search would begin through the streets of Hazleton. And neighbors would join in, understanding that when a child goes missing in a small community, everyone becomes part of the effort to bring them home. But as the afternoon wore on and no trace of Marise was found, a terrible truth was about to be discovered. Because the little girl who had left home that morning with such love in her heart and kindness in her intentions would never be coming home again. Because about 2 to 3 miles south of Hazleton, in a section of Hazel Township known as Millsville, an entirely different kind of routine was taking place. And a man decided to give his 16-year-old nephew driving lessons, choosing the quiet back roads where a nervous teenager could practice without the pressure of heavy traffic. And the area they selected was far from picturesque because the landscape was scarred by decades of coal mining, dotted with strip mines that had been abandoned when the coal was exhausted. So these defunct mining pits had become informal dumping grounds where locals would dispose of garbage. So it was essentially just a giant garbage dump. And it was just after 1 p.m. when the uncle and nephew were making their way along those back roads. And the teenager was concentrating on his driving, hands gripping the wheel as he navigated the unfamiliar terrain. But that's when something caught their attention in one of the old strip mining pits. And at first glance, it looked like a large doll had been discarded among the refuse. And the splash of blue fabric against the dark earth seemed almost innocent. Perhaps a child's toy that had been thrown away. But as they looked more closely, the horrible truth became clear. This wasn't a doll at all. And the man immediately stopped the car and approached the pit with growing dread. And what he discovered would haunt him for the rest of his life. Because there, among the garbage and debris that filled the abandoned coal stripping pit, lay the body of a small child. And the child would be a deceased Marise. And the scene was horrific. Marise's body was still warm to the touch when they went to check on her, indicating that she had been killed only hours before, if not sooner, and she had been bound and gagged and also physically essayed. And the cause of death looked to be that she was asphyxiated with her own shoelaces. You'd think the more I do these, it gets, easier to read. It just really doesn't. It just breaks my heart. And the 2 cans of fruit she had selected so carefully for her teacher were found right beside her body. Just a heartbreaking reminder of the innocent mission that had led to her death. And the discovery was immediately reported to police, who arrived at the scene within minutes. And the strip mining pit located in the Millsville section of Hazel Township became a crime scene unlike anything the local authorities had ever encountered. This wasn't just a murder, it was an act of unspeakable evil committed against a child whose only crime had been her desire to honor her teacher with a simple gift. So word of the discovery spread quickly through Hazleton, and a community where everyone knew everyone else, news traveled very fast. And Carmen Chiverella was still searching around St. Joseph's Church when a passerby, unaware of the devastating news they were delivering, casually mentioned that they had found, quote, the Chiverella girl dead. I just can't even imagine a mother or a father hearing in a conversation off to the side that their child is gone. It's just all so hard to comprehend. And I feel for the family. But the words would hit Carmen like a physical blow, and the father, who had been desperately hoping to find his daughter safe, was now facing every parent's worst nightmare. The little girl who had kissed him goodbye that morning, who had been looking forward to giving her teacher a gift, was never coming home. And back at the knitting mill, Marise Chiverella was experiencing something that could only be described as a mother's intuition. Even before she received the devastating news, she was overcome with a horrible sense of anxiety. And something was wrong, terribly, terribly wrong. And she knew it in her bones before anyone even said anything to her. So the discovery of Marise's body didn't just end one family's agonizing search, it just shattered the innocence of the entire community. And like I said before, Hazleton in 1964 was a place where children could play outside, you could leave your doors unlocked, and where the most serious crimes were minor thefts and domestic disputes. But now it held the brutal murder of a 9-year-old girl. It was just incomprehensible to everyone around. So as news of the discovery spread throughout the town, parents began calling their children home early from school, because the unthinkable had happened. A child had been murdered in their safe, quiet community. And the streets that had seemed so familiar and secure just hours before now felt different and dangerous and filled with shadows and possibilities that no one had previously imagined. So the initial investigation was thorough and immediate, and Pennsylvania State Police descended on the scene with every available resource, understanding that in cases involving child murder, the first 48 hours are crucial. so they carefully documented the crime scene and collected evidence, and began the painstaking process of trying to understand what had happened to Marise. And the evidence was both extensive and haunting, because the killer had been careless, leaving behind crucial clues that would prove important decades later. And DNA evidence was collected from Marise's clothing, and that key evidence was semen stains and pubic hair that were found on Marise's clothing. Just so disgusting and vile. But in 1964, DNA analysis was still decades away from being invented, so these pieces of evidence were carefully preserved without anyone understanding their future significance. And the investigation expanded rapidly throughout Hazleton and the surrounding area. And police interviewed hundreds of people, following up on every single lead, every suggestion, and every possibility. They would speak to neighbors, they would speak to teachers, they would speak to store owners, and just anyone who might have seen Marise on her final walk to school. And the community response was overwhelming, and everyone wanted to help find the monster who had killed an innocent child. And State Police Corporal Mark Barron would say, quote, "What happened to her ushered in a change in this community. Whether you like it or not, the way you lived changed after March 18th of 1964 in Hazleton." And for the Chiverella family, the investigation represented both hope and just pure torture, because it was hope that the killer would be found and brought to justice, but torture in having to relive the details of their daughter's murderer over and over again. Each interview, each lead, each development forced them to confront the horrible reality of what happened to their little girl. And Carmen and Marise Chiverella handled the tragedy with remarkable strength, though their pain was evident to everyone who knew them. They would cooperate fully with investigation, providing any information that might help catch their daughter's killer. But they also just had to continue living, which I can't even imagine, just going about your day after something like this happened, but they needed to work and support the rest of their family because they still had 4 surviving children to take care of. 4 children who were struggling to understand why their sister had been taken from them. And the investigation revealed several disturbing details about the crime. First, the killer had likely been familiar with the area, knowing about the abandoned strip mining pit where he could dispose of Marise's body. And the location suggested someone who understood the local geography, who knew where to go to avoid any sort of detection. So this led investigators to focus on local residents rather than transients or outsiders. But despite months of intensive investigation, leads began to dry up. And the Pennsylvania State Police interviewed hundreds of people, followed every possible clue, and pursued every theory. And suspects were developed and questioned, but none proved to be the killer. So the case that had seemed so promising in the beginning, with physical evidence and witness accounts, began to go stagnant. And the investigation consumed enormous resources, and more than 230 members of the Pennsylvania State Police worked on the case at various times, making it one of the largest investigations in the department's history. And Detective Thomas McAndrew, who would work on the case for 26 years, became particularly invested in finding Marise's killer. But despite his dedication and the dedication of countless other investigators, the case remained unsolved. And as months turned into years, the investigation evolved from active case to cold case. But the Pennsylvania State Police never gave up, and the case was reviewed annually, with new investigators bringing fresh perspectives to evidence. And new technologies were applied as they became available, and the case file grew thicker with each passing year. But the impact on the community was lasting, and Hazleton residents never forgot about Marise Chiverella, or the monster who had killed her. The case became part of the town's identity, a tragic chapter that reminded everyone of the day their community lost its innocence. And parents would continue to worry about their children's safety, and the murder remained a topic of conversation decades later. But sometimes the most difficult cases require unconventional solutions. And in 2020, a completely different kind of investigator would take an interest in the Marise Chiverella case. Someone who would approach it from an entirely new angle, using techniques that didn't even exist when the crime was committed. So Eric Schubert was just 18 years old when he first learned about the Marise Chiverella case, but he was already developing a reputation as something of a prodigy in the emerging field of genetic genealogy. A history major at Elizabethtown College in Pennsylvania, Schubert had been fascinated by genealogy since childhood, spending countless hours tracing family trees and learning about the complex relationships that connect all of us to our past. I was playing with my Tamagotchi, whereas this guy was literally making history as an early teen. Just extremely impressive. And what made Schubert unusual wasn't just his passion for genealogy, it was his understanding of how modern DNA technology could be combined with traditional genealogy research to solve a crime. And by the time he was in college, he had already helped other police agencies crack cold cases using genetic genealogy, a technique that blends DNA testing with family tree research to identify suspects and victims, which is crazy. This guy is insanely impressive at such a young age. So Schubert had spent years developing his skills in what was then a relatively new field, and he was the proprietor of ES Genealogy, his own research business, and had earned a reputation for being able to solve complex genealogy puzzles that stumped most experienced researchers. And in 2020, Schubert was looking for a new case to work on when he came across the story of Marise Chiverella. Now, the case immediately captured his attention, not just because of the tragic circumstances, but because he recognized that it might be solvable using the genetic genealogy techniques he had been perfecting. Because the case had that physical evidence, and also DNA profiles, and had been carefully preserved by investigators who understood its importance. It's so rare that we hear about old cases where they actually preserve the evidence. It's just like so incredibly lucky and so good on part of the Pennsylvania State Police that they did that. Like, it's just so incredible of them. But Schubert still faced a significant challenge because the Pennsylvania State Police, though very thorough with keeping evidence, were not fans of working with people outside of the police. They weren't fans of working with consultants, especially young college students with no formal law enforcement training, because the idea of allowing a teenager to work on one of their most important cold cases seemed unlikely at best. However, Schubert had something that impressed the investigators: a track record of success. His work on the other cold cases had demonstrated that genetic genealogy could solve cases that had stymied traditional investigators for decades. So when he approached the Pennsylvania State Police about working on the Chiverella case, they were surprised but willing to listen. Again, just 2 thumbs up to the Pennsylvania State Police. So the inevitable decision to work with Schubert represented a significant leap of faith for the Pennsylvania State Police, because they had been working on the case for over 50 years, applying every available technique and resource. So the idea that a college student might succeed where seasoned investigators had failed seemed almost impossible. So they were like, yeah, go for it, kid, why not? Because they were also aware that genetic genealogy was producing remarkable results in other jurisdictions, and they were willing to try anything that might finally solve their oldest cold case. So the partnership between Schubert and the Pennsylvania State Police began in 2020, at a time when the technique of genetic genealogy was still relatively new, like we talked about, but was beginning to produce impressive results across the country, such as the Golden State Killer case in California, which I covered, which is right here. If you want to go watch that, it's like multiple killers who were caught decades later. It's a very, very cool video. But the Golden State Killer case just showed that even decade-old cases could be solved by combining DNA evidence with genealogical research. And just for a little refresher, the Golden State Killer just basically just wanted to figure out like who his great-great-grandma was, and in doing that, got caught as the Golden State Killer. So it's a little freaky, all that stuff, but also clearly awesome for catching horrible criminals. But again, I have a more in-depth video if you want to go look into that. So Schubert's approach to the Chiverella case was methodical and patient. And he began by uploading the DNA profile from the crime scene to public genealogy databases, looking for distant relatives of the killer. Now, the process required extraordinary patience and skill, as he had to work backward from distant cousins to identify potential suspects who might have committed the crime. So the work was painstaking and often frustrating, because genetic genealogy requires researchers to build extensive family trees, often going back several generations to find common ancestors. And then they must work forward through multiple family lines, identifying all the descendants who might be connected to the DNA evidence. So it's a lot of like what ifs and mights and all this kind of stuff. It's very, very tedious. It's detective work that requires both scientific precision and genealogical intuition. So for Schubert, the Chiverella case became an obsession. And he would spend countless hours building family trees, analyzing DNA matches, and trying to identify potential suspects. And the work was emotionally demanding as well as intellectually challenging, because he was dealing with the most serious crime imaginable, the murder of a child, and he felt the weight of the responsibility to the family and to the community. And Schubert would later explain, quote, "The investigation that went into all this work was probably the hardest genealogy task that I've ever faced." Continuing, "This was probably the hardest thing that I've ever done in my entire life. And it means so much to me that I was able to be on the team that could provide answers to the Chiverella family." So, the young genealogist's dedication to the case was remarkable, and he would work side by side with the Pennsylvania State Police investigators, combining his expertise in genealogy with their knowledge of the case details. And it was just a collaboration that represented the best of both traditional investigation techniques and cutting-edge forensic science. Because when we work together, we make great things happen. So as Schubert worked through the complex family trees and DNA matches, he began to narrow down the possibilities. And the process was like solving a massive puzzle, with each piece of information bringing him closer to identifying the killer. And at a certain point, he began to feel confident that he was on the right track, saying, quote, "I knew we were going to find the assailant." So in 2020, after months of careful research, Schubert identified a distant cousin of the perpetrator in the genealogy database. And this was the crucial breakthrough that would eventually lead to solving the case. Because from this distant cousin, Schubert began building an extensive family tree, or building it out more, mapping out all the possible descendants who might be connected to the DNA evidence found at the crime scene. And the investigation kind of became a race against time in a different sense, because many potential suspects were elderly or had already died, making it difficult to collect DNA samples for comparison. So the passage of time that made the case so difficult to solve was also working against the investigators as they tried to verify their findings. But as Schubert's research progressed, one name began to emerge as the most likely suspect: James Paul Forte. Born in 1941, Forte was a bartender and a bar supplies salesman who lived in Hazleton his entire life. And he had been 22 years old at the time of Marise's murder and lived just 6 or 7 blocks from the Chiverella family home. And the genealogical evidence was compelling, but it needed to be verified through traditional DNA testing. And there was one significant problem. James Paul Forte had died in 1980. 42 years before the case was solved. He had suffered a heart attack at the age of 38 while working at a bar where he was employed. So the investigators faced a crucial decision. To definitively prove that Forte was the killer, they would need to obtain a DNA sample from his remains. And this would require exhuming his body, a dramatic and expensive step that needed to be justified by the strength of evidence. But the case for exhumation was very strong, and Schubert's genealogical research had identified Forte as the most likely suspect, and traditional investigative techniques had confirmed that he had been in the right place at the right time. And additionally, investigators discovered that Forte had a history of violent sexual behavior that made him a plausible suspect for such crime. Because in 1974, Forte had been arrested on charges of grape and SA. But he had been given a plea deal for the less serious conviction of aggravated assault and was sentenced to 1 year of probation. And in 1978, he was arrested again on charges of reckless endangerment and harassment. So this pattern of behavior suggested someone capable of escalating to much more serious crimes, like taking advantage of and murdering a child. So the decision to exhume Forte's body was approved in early 2022, nearly 58 years after Marise's murder. And the exhumation took place under carefully controlled conditions, with investigators collecting tissue samples that could be used for DNA analysis. And the process was both expensive and emotionally challenging for everyone involved, but it represented the best chance of finally solving this cold case. So the DNA analysis took several weeks to complete, and investigators had to extract usable DNA from tissue samples that were more than 40 years old, then compared to DNA evidence from that crime scene, which was 58 years previous. So the process required sophisticated forensic techniques and careful analysis to ensure accurate results. So on February 3rd, 2022, the results would come back. And the DNA from James Paul Forte's remains was a perfect match to the DNA evidence from Marise Chiverella's murder. So after nearly 58 years, the case had finally been solved. And this breakthrough just represented a remarkable achievement for both traditional investigative techniques and the cutting-edge forensic science techniques. Because the Pennsylvania State Police had preserved the evidence for decades, ensuring that when the technology became available, the case could be solved. Just an absolute win for police. And Eric Schubert had provided the genealogical expertise that made the identification possible. And the combination of both approaches had finally brought justice to Marise Chiverella and her entire family. So on February 10th, 2022, nearly 58 years after Marise Chiverella's murder, Pennsylvania State Police held a press conference that would finally provide answers to one of the state's oldest cold cases. And the room was packed with current and retired investigators, and members of the Chiverella family and members of the media who had followed the case for decades. And State Police Corporal Mark Barron, who had become the lead investigator on the case, stood at the podium with obvious emotion. Because this was a day that many people had thought would never come. And he would say, quote, "Today we can finally say that we know who killed Marise Chiverella. And through the combined efforts of traditional investigation and cutting-edge genetic genealogy, we have identified James Paul Forte as the person responsible for this horrific crime." And the announcement was met with a mixture of relief and sadness. Relief that the case had finally been solved, but sadness that it had taken so long and that the perpetrator had already died and couldn't be held accountable for his actions. But at least we can hopefully assume he's rotting in hell. And the press conference provided details about James that painted a picture of a man who had been hiding in plain sight for nearly 2 decades after the murder. Born in 1941, James had been a 22-year-old bartender living just blocks away from the Chiverella household when he killed Marise. And he had no known connection to the family, making his selection of Marise appear to be a crime of opportunity rather than a targeted attack. And he also had the history of sexual violence and criminal charges as well, as we spoke about. But perhaps the most disturbing was the realization that Forte had lived in Hazleton for 16 years after murdering Marise, continuing to work as a bartender and interact with community members who had no idea they were dealing with a child killer. And he had attended the same churches, shopped at the same stores, and lived in the same neighborhoods as the family he had devastated. And for the Chiverella family, the announcement brought a complex mix of emotions. And the 4 surviving siblings, Ron, Barry, Carmen, Marie, and David, were present at the press conference, representing a family that had waited their entire adult lives for this moment. And Ron would say, quote, "that we know the individual, it gives us a sense of closure." And continuing to say, no full closure, we'll never have that, but a sense of closure that we know the individual that did it, and that the individual isn't out committing the same crime and hurting other young girls like Marise. And Carmen Marie, Marise's sister, spoke emotionally about the impact of the case on their family, saying, quote, "We have so many precious memories of Marise. At the same time, our family will always feel the emptiness and sorrow of her absence. We will continue to ask ourselves, what would have been, what could have been?" But the family's response to the news was remarkable in its lack of hatred or desire for revenge. And their parents, Carmen and Mary Chiverella, had raised their children to focus on love and forgiveness rather than anger and retribution. Because even in the face of such tragedy, the family had maintained their faith and their commitment to justice rather than vengeance. And Ron would say, "It's never been about the hatred. It's never been about punishment or revenge, only justice." But the responses just demonstrated a remarkable strength of character that honor Marise's memory. And the press conference also highlighted the crucial role that Eric Schubert had played in solving the case, because the young genealogist, now 20 years old, was recognized for his extraordinary contribution to the investigation. And his work had accomplished what generations of experienced investigators had been unable to achieve, saying, quote, "Eric's work was instrumental in solving the case. His expertise in genetic genealogy combined with his dedication and persistence made it possible to identify James Paul Forte as the perpetrator. This case could not have been solved without his contributions," which I just think is so incredibly amazing for somebody to just see a case and be so dedicated to it, quite literally getting nothing in return besides the fact that he brought peace to a family and justice. So that is Marise's case. and Eric Schubert and everybody involved. Absolutely an incredible job, but an absolutely heartbreaking case. But it's good to know that the family can finally sleep at night knowing that that absolute waste of oxygen is in hell, burning in all sorts of ways, I hope. But it doesn't bring back their sister or their daughter. So my heart goes out to the family. And also, I don't mention this much, but part of the proceeds from these videos do go towards victims and their families. So that is extremely important to me. My goal, honestly, with this channel is to be able to give most, if not all, of the proceeds to families. And I also would like to make a charity. I'm working on that right now. So I just really want to give back to people because I can't even imagine what people are going through. All I can do is say their stories and keep your curious minds full. So that is the end of the video. Let me know other cases that you want me to go over. I always read the comments. That's where I get all of my ideas for these videos. So I appreciate you. I love you. Stay safe. And I'll see you in the next one. All right?